Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent, priest, king, and legend, begin not with a vanished city of gold and not with a prophecy about Europeans, but with stone on the high plateau of central Mexico at Teotihuacan, carved serpent heads once projected from the face of a great temple. Their bodies were not ordinary bodies, they carried feathers. Around them were shells, water signs, and the heavy geometry of a city that had been planned on an astonishing scale. Long before the Mexica Empire, long before the Spanish conquest, long before the name Quetzalcoatl became familiar in books, there was already a powerful Mesoamerican image, a serpent joined to the world of birds, sky, wind, water, earth, rulership, and sacred place. But the first caution is important. The people of Teotihuacan did not leave us a readable history in their own language. The name of the city itself comes from later Nahuatl speakers. The names we use for some of its monuments are later names. So when we look at the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, we are not looking at a simple portrait of the later Nahua deity under the same name. We are looking at an older iconographic world, partly visible and partly silent. The feathered serpent is there. Its exact name, prayers, stories, and local meanings are not fully recoverable. That gap is the beginning of the episode. Quetzalcoatl is not one simple character who walks unchanged through history. The name can refer to a god, it can refer to a priestly title, it can refer to a culture hero or remembered ruler, it can refer to a broad symbol whose earlier forms appear across Mesoamerica, and in the colonial period it becomes part of still another story, a story about the conquest, misunderstanding, prophecy, and the way later writers tried to explain catastrophe. The word Quetzalcoatl is often translated as feathered serpent from Quetzali, precious green feather, and Coatl, serpent. Even that translation is more than decorative. A serpent belongs to the earth, to caves, to water, to the surface of things that move close to the ground. A Quetzal feather belongs to height, color, preciousness, and the world above. The image joins domains that are normally separate. It makes one creature out of descent and flight, earth and air, hidden motion and shining display. At Teotihuacan, the feathered serpent imagery is monumental. The Ciudadela and the temple complex date roughly to the early centuries of the Common Era. The city itself was one of the great urban centers of the Indigenous Americas, with planned avenues, pyramids, apartment compounds, workshops, murals, and evidence for many communities drawn into a vast political and ritual landscape. Yet Teotihuacan also resists the kind of history that later empires sometimes provide. We do not have a king list in a familiar format. We do not have a native chronicle that simply tells us, this ruler built this temple for this god. So a slow documentary has to hold two truths at once. The archaeology is real and massive. The images are not imaginary. The feathered serpent is present in stone, mural, and architectural program. But the later stories of Quetzalcoatl cannot be pushed backward unchanged into Teotihuacan. To do that would make the evidence seem clearer than it is. It would turn an ancient symbol into a modern shortcut. Instead, we can say this. By the time later Central Mexican traditions give us the name Quetzalcoatl in fuller mythic and ritual settings, they inherit a much older Mesoamerican habit of thinking with serpents, birds, wind, water, and power. The later god did not appear from nowhere, but neither is every feathered serpent everywhere the same person. This is the first layer, the symbol before the biography. Imagine standing before the temple face at Teotihuacan when its carved heads were still painted and its plaza still active. There may have been processions, there may have been offerings, there were certainly political meanings in the architecture because monumental religion and rulership were rarely separate. Serpents seem to emerge from the structure itself, as if the building were a sacred body. Marine shells evoke water and distant exchange. Feathers evoke prestige and the sky. The whole program suggests a world ordered through forces that cross boundaries, but we should not fill the silence with fantasy. There is no need to call this Atlantis or a lost white teacher or visitors from another world. The real history is stranger and more interesting, a vast indigenous city with its own language or languages, its own political system, its own rituals, and a religious vocabulary we can partly see but cannot fully translate. When later Nahua and Mexica sources speak of Quetzalcoatl, they do so after many centuries of change. The world of Teotihuacan had risen and fallen. Tula, or Tollan, had become another great name in memory and politics. The Mexica had built their capital at Tenochtitlan and had inherited, reworked, and argued with older traditions. Then conquest came, and many of the sources we now depend on were written under colonial conditions, often with Nahua elders, artists, and authors working alongside Spanish friars or within Spanish institutions. One of the most important of these sources is the Florentine Codex, associated with Bernardino de Sahagun and Nahua collaborators in the 16th century. It is a treasure, but not a transparent window. It was made after the conquest. It was shaped by translation, Christian concerns, indigenous memory, Spanish inquiry, and the political pressure of a broken world. To use it responsibly, we have to name that mediation. Within that later central Mexican world, Quetzalcoatl appears as a major divine figure, connected with wind, learning, priesthood, order, and sacred knowledge. In some contexts, he is associated with Ehecatl, the wind aspect, and with the forces that prepare the way for rain. Temples to wind gods could take rounded forms so that the wind would move around them. Breath, word, and movement belong together here. The god is not simply a dragon and not simply a snake with feathers. He is part of a religious and cosmological system in which air, calendar, ritual speech, and rulership all matter. This second layer is the deity, Quetzalcoatl, as a name in Nahua religion, not as an isolated monster, but as part of a dense network of gods, rituals, signs, and offices. The third layer is more difficult because here God, title, and memory begin to braid together. Central Mexican traditions remember a figure often called Ce Acatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. One read, Our Lord, Feathered Serpent. He is linked with Tollan, or Tula, with priestly rule, with learning, and with a departure from the city after conflict, deception, or moral rupture. In later tellings, he may move eastward. He may die, burn, vanish, or be transformed. Venus associations sometimes enter the story. The pattern is powerful. A sacred ruler loses or leaves a city, and his departure becomes one of the great memories of central Mexico. But again, the episode has to slow down. We cannot treat this as a modern biography, as if we had a diary of a single king. The surviving versions are later, colonial, and mythic historical. Names can be titles, calendar names can become identities. Tollan can be a real place, an ideal city, and a political memory all at once. Quetzalcoatl can be god, priest, ruler, and office. The tradition does not separate those categories in the way a modern archive might want. That does not make it worthless. It means it must be read on its own terms. Tula was a real city. Tollan was also an idea of civilized prestige. Later peoples looked back to it as a source of legitimacy, artistry, and sacred authority. To claim a connection to Tollan was not only to make a statement about the past, it was to speak about the right to rule in the present. When Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl appears in this memory world, he is not just an individual. He is a vessel for debates about proper kingship, priesthood, sacrifice, order, temptation, loss, and renewal. This is one reason the legend keeps attracting modern misunderstanding. People want Quetzalcoatl to be one thing: a peaceful reformer, a historical king, a creator god, a white visitor, a prophecy, a comet, a planet, a symbol of universal religion. But the sources preserve something more layered. The name survives because it could hold many meanings at once. Consider the eastward departure motif. In some popular retellings, this becomes a neat prophecy. Quetzalcoatl left to the east and promised to return. Therefore, when ships arrived from the east, the Mexica thought their god had come back. This story is famous. It is also one of the most dangerous simplifications in the whole Quetzalcoatl tradition. Modern historians have spent a great deal of effort questioning it. The claim that the Mexica, or Moctezuma in particular, simply believed Hernan Cortes was the returning Quetzalcoatl should not be treated as a straightforward fact. It appears to develop in colonial narratives after the conquest, in a world where Spanish writers had strong reasons to make conquest seem destined, providential, or enabled by indigenous confusion. Later versions made the story even cleaner and more dramatic. The Aztecs expected a white-bearded god, and so empire fell because of myth. That is not careful history. The conquest of Mexico was not caused by one superstition. It involved Spanish violence, indigenous alliances against Mexica power, political fractures, epidemics, military technology, diplomacy, coercion, and decisions made by many indigenous actors with their own strategies and knowledge. To say the Mexica lost because they mistook Cortes for Quetzalcoatl is not only inaccurate, it removes indigenous agency. It turns a vast historical catastrophe into a fable about naivety. So the fourth layer is colonial memory, the way Quetzalcoatl became part of the explanation for conquest. This does not mean that omens, signs, and sacred interpretation were irrelevant. 16th century people interpreted events religiously. They watched the sky. They read disasters through inherited categories. But the neat returning God story, especially in the form repeated in schoolbooks and documentaries, is a later construction that must be handled with suspicion. A respectful episode should say some colonial sources and later traditions connect conquest memory with Quetzalcoatl, but the popular claim that Moctezuma simply thought Cortes was Quetzalcoatl is a contested and likely misleading simplification. It tells us at least as much about colonial storytelling as it does about pre-conquest belief. This distinction matters because Quetzalcoatl has often been pulled into fringe theories. In older European and American writing, he was sometimes imagined as a white civilizer from across the sea. In modern pseudo-history, he may be made into an Atlantean, an ancient astronaut, a lost missionary, or proof of transoceanic contact. These claims usually depend on flattening indigenous sources, ignoring chronology, and treating metaphor as coded evidence for outsiders. The real feathered serpent does not need those inventions. Quetzalcoatl belongs to Mesoamerican history. The image has deep indigenous roots. The name has Nahua linguistic and religious life. The stories were preserved, reshaped, and sometimes wounded by colonial mediation. The complexity is not a problem to solve away. It is the subject itself. To understand why the feathered serpent mattered, it helps to think about movement between worlds. Serpents move through earth, water, and undergrowth. Birds move through air. Feathers mark preciousness and height. Wind is invisible but powerful. It arrives before rain, enters the body as breath, and carries speech. A ruler must link human society to cosmic order. A priest must speak the right words in the right time. A city must make itself an image of the universe. In that kind of world, a feathered serpent is not a random hybrid. It is a theological argument in visual form. At Teotihuacan, that argument was carved into a city whose original voices are mostly lost. In later Nahua religion, it became attached to names, rites, and divine offices we can partially recover. In the Tollan cycle, it became tangled with the memory of a priest-king. After conquest, it became part of the stories people told to explain how one world had been shattered by another. There is also a modern temptation to make Quetzalcoatl gentle by contrast with other deities, as if the feathered serpent can be separated from the harder realities of Mesoamerican ritual life. That too is too easy. Central Mexican religion included offerings, discipline, fasting, blood, sacrifice, calendar obligation, and political violence. But sensationalism is just as distorting as sanitizing. The goal is not to make the past comfortable or monstrous. The goal is to let it remain human, religious, political, and strange in its own terms. A slow history of Quetzalcoatl therefore moves in circles rather than in a straight line. First, the old image, feathered serpents in monumental art, especially at Teotihuacan, where architecture gives us evidence without giving us a simple script. Second, the later deity, Quetzalcoatl in Nahua and Mexica religious worlds, connected with wind, priesthood, knowledge, and cosmic order, as preserved in colonial-era sources that must be used with care. Third, the Tollan memory, Topiltzin Ce Acatl Quetzalcoatl, a figure in whom ruler, priest, title, and god name overlap, carrying ideas about sacred kingship, loss, exile, and legitimacy. Fourth, the colonial afterlife, the returning god legend and the claim about Cortes, which tells us how conquest was explained after the fact and why simple stories can become more famous than difficult histories. And beneath all four layers is a wider Mesoamerican habit of seeing power in beings that cross boundaries. A feathered serpent is boundary crossing made visible. It crawls and flies, it rises and descends, it belongs to earth and sky. It is old enough to precede the clearest texts and flexible enough to survive conquest, scholarship, nationalism, New Age reinvention, and popular myth. This survival is not accidental. Symbols that endure usually do so because they are not exhausted by one meaning. Quetzalcoatl could be invoked in ritual, carved in stone, remembered as a ruler, argued over by historians, and misused by colonizers and fantasists. Each use leaves a trace. Each trace has to be separated from the others, not because they are unrelated, but because confusion is where bad history grows. So if we return at the end to the carved heads of Teotihuacan, we should see them differently. They are not illustrations for a later myth book. They are not proof that every story about Quetzalcoatl was already complete in the 2nd or 3rd century. They are not coded messages from a lost civilization outside Mesoamerica. They are stone witnesses to an older religious imagination, one that later peoples inherited in ways we can only partly reconstruct. The city around them declined. Its original name was forgotten. Later visitors gave it new names and new meanings. The Mexica looked back on ancient ruins and older Toltec prestige. Colonial writers recorded traditions through the broken lens of conquest. Modern readers inherited the most dramatic fragments and often mistook them for the whole. But the feathered serpent remained. Perhaps that is the best way to understand Quetzalcoatl, not as a riddle with one hidden answer, but as a long memory moving through different worlds. In one world, it is architecture and image. In another, it is wind and sacred knowledge. In another, a priest-king leaves a city and becomes legend. In another, a conquered society and its conquerors struggle to explain what happened, and the old name becomes part of a new story. The task is not to choose one layer and throw away the rest. It is to keep them in order. The feathered serpent before the name, the deity within Nahua religion, the ruler remembered through Tollan, the colonial legend that made conquest seem foretold, and finally the modern responsibility to resist the easy version. Quetzalcoatl was not a European visitor. He was not a spaceship pilot. He was not simply Cortes in disguise, waiting for history to recognize him. He was and remains a sign of indigenous worlds that were intellectually rich, regionally varied, and historically layered long before outsiders tried to explain them. In the quiet of the ruins, the serpent still rises from stone with feathers along its body. It asks us to look carefully, not to flatten, not to rush, not to turn uncertainty into spectacle, only to follow the layers, earth, sky, breath, memory, and the long afterlife of a name.